Ja, herzlich willkommen nun zum Höhepunkt vielleicht unserer Veranstaltung, unserer Jahrestagung, nämlich diesem Abendvortrag von Ittai Gradel. Ich möchte mich vielleicht aber vorweg auch noch mal bedanken bei allen Vortragenden, die heute vorgetragen haben, die morgen auch noch vortragen werden. Also das ist bisher eine unheimlich tolle Tagung. Ich habe sehr viel positive Rückmeldungen bekommen und ich will das auch schon mal andeuten. Es plant der alte in Kombination mit dem neuen Vorstand doch diese Jahrestagung zu publizieren in Buchform. Also es war mehrfach der Wunsch jetzt herangetragen worden an das Organisationsteam und ich warne also alle, die jetzt geredet haben oder reden werden, vor, dass wir uns dann in den nächsten Wochen und Monaten an sie wenden werden. Und ich glaube, das ist ein echter Gewinn für unsere Wissenschaft. Aber jetzt kommen wir zu Ittai Gradel. Vielleicht fragen sich einige von Ihnen, wer ist Ittai Gradel? Nun, die beste Beschreibung, Herr Gradel, habe ich gefunden im Wall Street Journal vom 23. Oktober 2023. An academic turned gem dealer in Denmark. Ja, das klingt auch erstmal sehr schräg. Sie selbst nennt sich, glaube ich, Independent Researcher mit Schwerpunkt Gemmen und Kameen, aber Sie waren auch als Kunsthändler tätig. Definitiv sind sie kein niederländischer Antiquitätenhändler, wie die Süddeutsche Zeitung noch am 24. August 2023 schrieb. Aber man merkt schon, Wall Street Journal, Süddeutsche Zeitung, was war passiert? Wieso haben sie diese Aufmerksamkeit erlangt? Nun, 2016 fiel ihnen auf, dass über eBay ein römisches Schmuckstück angeboten wurde, das aus der Sammlung Townley stammte. Das Stück war zuvor auf einer Website des British Museum erschienen, dort jedoch wieder gelöscht worden. Immer wieder tauchten offenbar Stücke aus dieser Sammlung bei eBay auf, immer von dem Verkäufer Sultan 1966. Dahinter verbarg sich Peter Hicks, der seit über 30 Jahren für das Museum arbeitete. Einige mögen ihn auch kennen, zum Beispiel Frau Krienen, der hat nämlich auch eben über den sogenannten dieses praxitelische Stück, das Sie vorgestellt haben, gearbeitet und darüber publiziert. Also eigentlich ein wirklich sehr bekannter, renommierter Archäologe. Aber er bot nun als Sultan 1966 über Jahre deutlich unter Wert Kleinkunst bei eBay an, rechnete aber nicht mit dem phänomenalen Gedächtnis von Ittai Gradel, der eine bereits publizierte Gemme, also daumengroß, ja, und davon gibt es sehr, sehr viele, der sie wiedererkannte. Unglaublich. Nach dem Aufdecken des Skandals beschuldigte Hartwig Fischer, der damalige Direktor des British Museum, am 24. August 2023 in der FAZ den, ich zitiere, Antikenhändler Ittai Gradel, er habe nicht auf das volle Ausmaß des Verbrechens hingewiesen und trage damit eine Mitverantwortung. Gradel konterte, das British Museum habe ihn wie ein Dorftrottel behandelt. Inzwischen wurde ermittelt, dass rund 2000 Objekte fehlen oder beschädigt waren. Über 600 sind inzwischen wieder zurückgegeben worden. Und Hartwig Fischer ist am 25. August 2023 als Direktor des British Museum in London zurückgetreten. Ittai Gradel hat damit eines der größten Erdbeben in der jüngeren Museumsgeschichte ausgelöst. Ich erinnere mich persönlich an eigene Gespräche mit Ihnen im Sommer 2023, als Sie mich hinwiesen, dass da ein ganz großer Skandal kommen würde, den Sie ausgelöst hätten. Und ich habe mich gefragt, what the hell kann ein Gemmenforscher für einen Skandal auslösen? Heute kann ich nur sagen, klein, aber oho. Alles Weitere kommt nun von Ihnen selbst. Sie werden aber gar nicht so sehr über diesen Skandal reden, sondern vor allen Dingen über Orphans. Und da können Sie sehr gut anschließen an das, was wir heute Morgen schon von Herrn Kahn gehört haben. Wir freuen uns auf Ihren Vortrag.
Haben Sie herzlichen Dank, Frau Lemke, für diese schöne Introduktion und Anpreisung von mir und auch für die Einladung, hier zu sprechen in diesen schönen Umgebungen und für ein so interessantes und wissendes Publikum. Ich muss mich aber entschuldigen, dass ich meinen Vortrag auf Englisch halten werde. weil ich finde, die Problemstellungen, die ich behandeln will, sind so kompliziert, dass es ist sehr wichtig, dass ich mit äußerster oder mit äußerster Präzision ausdrücken kann, und das fällt mir leichter auf Englisch als auf Deutsch. So I will switch to English as you have also up here as my intro, and I have a script here of sorts. My own position or background is unusual insofar as I was once upon a time, in a previous life, I was actually a university academic. I ended up being an associate professor, so I had a tenured university job at Reading University, associate professorship in the history and archaeology of the Roman Empire. But in 2008, I left this position and started independently, started my own little business as an antiquarian book dealer, and gem dealer in bits of medieval manuscripts, bits and bobs, odds and ends. And as it turned out, gems became my main trick. Simply for the reason that was where I could make money and could make a living, because there was clearly a niche in the market there. Can you all hear me? One thing that struck me was this aspect of commerciality. You will maybe notice here that I put in a bit of a tease in my first sentence here, that the Antiquities trade and Archaeological Scholarship represent two different kinds of commercial engagement with the past, and that may strike some of you as an odd way of phrasing it, because many academics, whether employed in universities or museums, tend to see themselves as above all these commercial aspects, sleazy, dirty commercial aspects that are characteristic for the marketplace, the wheeling and dealing in ancient objects. However, my background means I can actually, I have been working on both sides of the fence, or both, should we say, on both sides of this trench, as it is increasingly becoming. And obviously, being in a university academic is an extremely commercial business also. In fact, as I recall it, there was far more talk of money all the time in my university environment than I have experienced between myself and fellow antiquities dealers. None of us can escape the tyranny of money ultimately. But we are into a very sad development in these years, which has come from the US mainly, and we've been strongest there, which is extremely hostile to the trade in antiquities. And this is unfortunate for many reasons. Like all these sort of, you could, if you sort of in very general terms, you could call it an aspect of the whole woke ideology, a wave that comes from the US. And as with all of these woke ideas, there is a core of common sense of something that is correct and right, buried deep within all the nonsense, but it is carried too far into absurdity. And of course, as we've heard about, the scandalous circumstances of the antiquities trade in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, where museums, especially the big American ones, behaved with complete impunity and total lack of any ethics and morality, and basically financed the whole army of Tombaroli. Those conditions, obviously, it is good and healthy that a reaction set in against that. We can all agree, I'm sure that obviously illegal, illicit excavations or Raubgrabungen is something that should be fought as much as we can. However, it is a very complicated matter, and in some respects, I think the pendulum has swung far too much back the other way. It is now becoming a common requirement for publishing in academic archaeological journals in the Anglo-Saxon world that such publications or articles must not contain any reference to any archaeological object that was not already published before 1970 or without a known pre-1970 provenance. The year 1970 is essentially an arbitrary one, but we have all heard that it goes back to the UNESCO convention, but one might as well have said a completely different year. But this means, in effect, that archaeologists will be forced, when publishing and interpreting objects, also objects that come from perfectly legitimate archaeological excavations, they will be forced increasingly to ignore parallel material that can sometimes actually answer the interpretation of objects, and which are certainly relevant to such discussions. And with 1970 as a fixed point in time, the problem will become ever greater. We're now 55 years away from that fixed point in time, but it is 1970, it will be also in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 100, 150 years' time, which means all material that has come onto the marketplace in that period should, according to these standards, should be excluded from academic discussions. The result of that will be that academic archaeology will turn into a fictitious parallel universe where discussions are being had, pseudo-discussions are being had, pseudo-academic, pseudo-discussions will be had about problems where both parties in these debates actually know the answer, because the answer has been given by objects that are well known, have appeared in the marketplace, but none of the parties engaged in such a debate are allowed to refer to these objects, so both parties have to pretend that they don't exist and that their discussion is actually has any scholarly or academic merit. The ultimate consequence of this demand that a large part of objects should be ignored in academic debate and publications if they don't have the precious pre-1970 provenance or the publication record. The ultimate consequence can only be the death of archaeology, classical archaeology, as an academic discipline. It will be reduced to nothing more than a handicraft, a question of excavation techniques. But in academic terms, it cannot in the long run survive this onslaught. Sadly, in recent years, the development has not gone my way. Things seem to be getting worse and worse. I publish in art historical journals in the Anglo-Saxon world because I feel I'm pretty much cut off from publishing in archaeological journals because of this 1970 requirement. And we have just heard, for instance, earlier today, that Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg have now decided, or 2 years ago, I think it was 2022, they decided that they would in future not exhibit any private collections of antiquities ever again. So that is one further step in this process of cutting off all disrupting all the connections, all communications between the antiquities market, the art market, and private collectors and the academic world as it is found in museums. And this will be a disaster for all parties concerned, because the trade needs the expertise that is found in museums and universities. But the opposite is also very much true, that museums need the trade and its expertise to keep an eye on what appears in the marketplace. For instance, the trade is needed in order to discover if some objects are floating around out there which are actually illegal and illicit. And this is where I, as Frau Lemke told you about, where I did acquire some expertise, and my 15 minutes of fame, as we will have all been promised we will all achieve at some point. When I bought antiquities, several hundreds of them actually, Roman glass gems, most of them, and slowly came to realize that these had actually been stolen from the British Museum. So they were, well, they're not your normal types of Raubgrabungen or illegally excavated objects, but they had certainly been illegally excavated, if you can say that, from the storerooms of the British Museum. And that is, of course, an unusual case, but I think it is a very good example of why museums also need dealers, because only dealers will actually know what takes place in the marketplace. Museums need dealers who actually are serious about checking provenance to the best of their limited ability, because there's so much we can't check for various reasons, and that is a problem with the art market. There are many problems with the art market. One of them is that it is a very secretive world. There's far too little transparency, far too much secrecy. One problem I have constantly encountered when doing provenance research is in writing to auction houses. If I acquire an object, I ask them, where does this come from? I'm told, old German collection, old French collection, whatever. And then I continue, could I have the name, please? And then they say, sorry, client confidentiality. We can't give the name. This is one area where I think the law could actually help us all by simply making, and this is, some would find this is quite drastic, and it is, because it is in a way a limitation of the rights of private ownership. But my personal view is that it should actually be made illegal to claim anonymity as the owner of or possessor of antiquities, because they do in a certain sense belong to the public at large, to everybody. And the actual legal owners of them are merely custodians. And with that custodianship should also come a degree of responsibility. In practice, this is a great problem, because this anonymity, which is upheld by auction houses and dealers and such, means that most provenance researches go up to a certain point and then they have to stop and you can get nowhere. So that is one specific suggestion I would have, that legally anonymity should simply not be allowed, and if collectors of antiquities do not like this, then they should find other areas in which to collect. Another unfortunate aspect is this fixed date of 1970, as I've already suggested, because the longer time passes, the more the problem will be aggravated. It will simply get bigger all the time. What would be much more sensible would have to be to have a rolling deadline where you said that things could only enter academic discourse if it had been published or provenance established at least, shall we say, 20 or 25 years before. Because that means that all new material will eventually be able to enter into academic discourse, but it will be commercially senseless. It will not pay off commercially to acquire an object and then having to wait for 20 to 25 years before actually getting it published and then seeing its commercial value rise as a consequence of that. So that is one way where one could actually cut off the commercial aspects of the problem, but still ensure that eventually, with a delay, a time fuse, so to speak, such objects could actually enter into academic debate. I will give you one example. It's a drastic claim to make that academic scholarship will eventually simply die in any meaningful sense if we accept this 1970 rule. The problem basically concerns the orphans. And my prime interest here is not the gorgeous examples of Greek painted pottery or Roman and Greek marble sculpture in the hundreds of thousands or $1 million class. I would say these objects that are very, very commercially valuable are very often academically without any interest whatsoever. Academic and commercial interests do not follow each other at all. Quite often there's a dichotomy that it's almost in inverse proportion. I remember recently I was a friend of mine who works at Sotheby's showed me a gorgeous bust of Antoninus Pius, technically a very fine piece of Roman sculpture, and glorious old manor house, English manor house, early 19th century Provenance. And it sold for $8 million or pounds or whatever. And I shocked my friend by saying, this is a technically very fine piece of sculpture, it has glorious provenance, but it is dull as dishwater, because in academic terms it tells us, and what is academic scholarship about if it's not about acquiring new knowledge? And in academic terms it tells us absolutely nothing we didn't know before already. Antoninus Pius, as you probably know, has only one known portrait type as emperor, so this head basically, it was very unusually fine technical quality, but it basically looked like all the other portraits of Antoninus Pius. So here you have yet another one, number 89, to add to the 88 you already had. It's totally without academic interest, despite the price of $8 million or pounds, whatever. Whereas the examples I will now talk about, they are objects that can actually add to our knowledge and are academically of great interest, but whose commercial value is in the region of between 100 to maybe 250 euros a piece, a group of Roman rings. And this is a project that I've been engaged on for some years. It began 2019, and where I have actually written a book that is due to appear with Mohr-Siebeck publishers in November, probably. I've written it with a Danish friend of mine. Where is, there's the dot. It's so tiny. If I can't see, you probably can't either. But anyway, Niels Arne Pedersen is a good friend of mine, a professor of the history of the early Christian church. And we have had great fun working on this together. I came with sort of archaeological and historical expertise, and he came with his expertise of theology, church, and church history. The Lost Novel of King Solomon and the Demons, new evidence on the Testament of Solomon in antiquity. Now this, and I don't mention this primarily to advertise my book here, though I'm not in principle averse or hostile to the idea of advertising my own work, but that is actually not the main point here. The main point is that the book is based on a series of archaeological objects that can actually elucidate, tell us something about a weird and wonderful, fascinating early text called the Testament of Solomon. And this is a tale, a story of how King Solomon, with the help of a magical ring given him by God, gained power over all the demons of the entire world. And then, quite sensibly, he used them as a source of manual labor, hyper-effective source of manual labor, and set them to the task of building his temple in Jerusalem. But finally, and that is a bit like the biblical model in the Book of Kings, actually. Finally, he lost control. He lost the favor of God and control over the demons in the end, because he couldn't control his own libido. He went for whoring around with foreign Gentile women and began sacrificing to foreign gods and building temples to them. And therefore, the demons escaped his control eventually, and that is where the text ends. It is a fairly brief text, and it's basically a large part of it consists of a catalogue of demons who are very weird and eccentric bunches. Some of them half snail, half man, half this, that. Complete wonderful descriptions of these composite creatures. And then also naming, in many cases, what angel name can be used to actually combat the demons. So it's also, to some extent, was a handbook of sorts that could be used in practical terms to fight off the demons. The full text is known only from late medieval manuscripts. Some earlier manuscripts which contain excerpts, but very few. And in this late version, we have in these late manuscripts, it's clearly a Christian text because there are references to the future. It's seen from Solomon's perspective, but the demon's prophecy about the future coming of Jesus Christ. The date of when the text was originally composed has been very much discussed, and it has often been claimed that it must have originally have been a Jewish text and wasn't a Christian one. The argument, I think, is basically, in a way, of an apologetic nature, because it seems from a Christian point of view, it seems so heretical and so totally opposed to what the early church fathers say about how to combat demons. The stance of the early church fathers was that the only sort of trick that was allowed in combating demons was to use the name of Jesus Christ against them, and that would always be effective. But here we are actually dealing with all sorts of other formulas, and it's actually the hero here is not Jesus Christ or Jesus, the name of Jesus, it's King Solomon who has this power over the demons. So, in short, and I think that it's because it seems so unorthodox or strange or even heretical from a Christian point of view, and that is why it has sort of been wiped off on the Jews, that this is so weird that it must be something Jewish, it can't really be a Christian text. But the text actually has amazingly a wide following today. If you search for it, if you search for the words Testament of Solomon on YouTube, these are just two examples of what will pop up with plenty of views. Here you have 2.2 million views there, and they have sort of cartoons or drawings and retellings of this strange tale.
It functions. It functions.
Oh, good. Yes, right. So as I said, actually the occultists or perhaps even Satanists or people interested in the occult, the text has a certain following even today. And in 2019 I acquired a Roman ring. This is where, as a gem scholar, the ring contained a ringstone, a gem, not a very pretty one, but interesting because it carried an inscription that said Solomon legi phylaxe, which should mean Solomon said, watch out, beware. And I bought it simply for, I think, 200 euros, a hammer in a provincial German auction, because I was curious as to what the meaning was. I had no idea how to interpret this. My friend then drew my attention to the Testament of Solomon, and yes, indeed, it seems to be a quote from a very early version of this text, which is otherwise, this part of the text, otherwise known only from manuscripts which are more than 1,000 years later. So this ring and its fellows by far constitute the very, very earliest manuscript, even of an untraditional sort, of this text. The reason for it, why it's quoted here, is that the quote comes from Solomon's final demon coercion. At the end of the text, he manages to entrap and coerce the world's two strongest, mightiest demons, and he orders them then to carry an enormous column into the sky and hold it there till the end of time, and they promise to do so. And that means, since the column, which is probably intended for the Milky Way, since it's still there, that means that this demon coercion, as the only one of Solomon's demon coercions, this is the only case where Solomon's power over the demons actually lasted beyond his own time. And that would have meant that this demon coercion, those words of Solomon addressed to these demons, or to one of them, that would have meant it would have been of special interest to early Christians who thought of ways of how they could keep the demons at bay or combat them. Only one of these rings, or in this case just a ring stone. Only one of them has a good old publication record, namely one that was not a good record, but at least an old one. There's a ring stone in Istanbul, this one, which was published in 1903, very briefly. It has the same text with a slight variation. And what may also be of interest is that there are remains of the iron from the ring setting on it. Now, Roman iron rings are not unusual, of course, but in this case may have a particular significance because, as is and was always commonly known, demons are very scared of iron. They can't stand iron. So this may have added to the effectiveness. The other one that came, that was the first ring that I saw and acquired, and that came, the auction house told me, from the estate of the Frankfurt archaeologist Karl Maria Kaufmann, who died in 1951, and who's known primarily as the discoverer or rediscoverer of the Christian pilgrim site, Abu Mena, or the city of Menas in the western desert in Egypt, southwest of Alexandria. A very important early Christian site, which was then abandoned sometime in the 9th century. And Kaufmann rediscovered it and excavated it for a couple of years, 1906 to 8. Sadly, his excavations were never fully published. But this ring, which came from his estate, with my searching, my research, I managed to establish that it had a much older, absolutely fascinating provenance story behind it. Not only did it come from Kaufmann's estate, but it must be the same ring that was in, here it is. You should actually be allowed finally to see this ring. So I've babbled on so long about it. Here it is. And what is great about this ring is that it is typologically the shape of the ring stone, of the ring itself. Can be very clearly, narrowly dated to the first quarter of the 3rd century AD. All these rings are 3rd century, the whole group of 10 rings. There's the ring. And I went through and read everything Kaufmann had published about his excavations. There was nothing in his scientific or scholarly publication records from his excavations at Abu Mena. But and when he was already an elderly gentleman in 1928, he published memoirs, a book of memoirs for a popular audience. This work here in 1928, Ausgräber, Mumienjäger und tote Städte von der Romantik der Forschung im Orient aufgrund eigener Erlebnisse. And in that book, he mentions a meeting with an old Bedouin in the excavation camp on the 2nd of March, 1906. He even has an illustration here in the book of the old Bedouin. This is Kaufmann himself sitting there, and they're negotiating about the amount of bakshish to be paid out to the elderly gentleman. When I say elderly, that's a euphemism because he's described as very old, ancient, uralt. And I even managed to actually find the original drawing behind this cruder published version. Here's the original drawing, and that shows a bit more detail. In this one, you can actually see the ring on the Bedouin's finger. Now, Kaufmann describes this ring with just enough words to enable me to, I think, with absolute certainty, to establish that this is the ring that came out of his estate, which I bought in 2019. And the old man, the old Bedouin, actually told Kaufmann that the ring had been above ground for a very long time. His father had discovered it by accident when he came across. He put up his tent and he struck a Christian grave, which was later excavated by Kaufmann, dated this series of graves where it came from to the 5th century. So a grave that was at least 200 years later than the ring found in it. But his father, the old Bedouin's father, had discovered this grave, and in the grave was a skeleton, and on the skeleton's finger was this ring. And as the old Bedouin said, my father wore it for the rest of his life. I shall wear it. I have worn it since his death, and after me, my son and my grandsons shall also wear it. So it had clearly been above ground and used for a considerable time, which actually fits perfectly with its appearance, because there are, by the ringstone where the bronze surface was protected from wear by the protruding stone, you do actually see tiny remnants of the original patina found there, normal green excavation patina, but everywhere else it is actually rubbed off down to the bronze, and that fits the old Bedouin's description perfectly. That this was a ring that was actually worn for generations after it left the ground in modern times, which is not very common for a Roman ring. So everything actually fits with the story. This must be the ring. The old Bedouin also said that his father made this discovery when the old Bedouin himself, was only a small boy. So that brings us back to the mid-19th century, actually, and that means also that the ring is clearly the first documentable find from Abu Mena, as it happens. But from 2019 and onwards, I've found them in auctions, coin auctions typically, one ring after the other. So I ended up with 4 rings, namely these 4, and the last one was a chalcedony ringstone, which I found in a Hirsch Munich auction earlier this year. So 5 examples. The problem, no, I'll get to that in a bit, because what is characteristic of 2 of these rings, and some of them, most of them are not don't have gemstones. They're more humble sort. They are engraved directly. The text is engraved directly into the bronze, and they are all of them. These 2 certainly, and these 3. They must have come from the same workshop, possibly engraved by the same hand, because the lettering, everything is so similar in the entire group. So that's 5 rings which would have come completely contemporary with each other and would have come from the same workshop. And 2 of the rings contain Christian symbols: fish, and here also fish, and an anchor. So that means if the Testament of Solomon was actually read and used for magical apotropaic purposes already in the early 3rd century AD, then it is pretty unavoidable to conclude that it was from its very outset a Christian text. And the Jews can be let off the hook. In this instance, it was always a Christian text. And the text itself must have been very early, actually, because if it could be used already in the early 3rd century, as per the date of the earliest date of the rings, namely the Kaufmann ring here, then it must have, you must presuppose that it must have had some time to establish itself, to acquire this magical authority, and therefore the text itself must belong in the 2nd century AD. It can't be any earlier because it contains quotes and references from New Testament texts. So with these rings, I can actually, for the first time, give physical evidence for the date of the earliest version of this Christian demonology, this early Christian text, the Testament of Solomon. This ring to the right is of some interest also because that is a slightly later ring form. Here we are in the mid-3rd century AD. And we began with my co-author and I, we wanted to write an article about this. We thought it was interesting. It swelled up into a book now, and as I said to my friend, we have now written 300 pages on 3 words on these rings there. He didn't find that very funny. He's a very serious scholar. It's about a lot more than those 3 words, he told me rather grumpily. So that was actually it. But what is the relevance of all this here? Well, my point is that this investigation, this group of 10 rings, I should add, 5 with me, only one of them has old provenance, namely the Kaufmann ring. The others I've been told they were acquired 20 years earlier at some coin fair, but it's only von Hörensagen anyway, so can't really be used for much. And that is, of course, typical for such small object of limited commercial value that is typically handled and traded by coin dealers. They're never accompanied by a good old provenance information, because why should they be? Because till very recently nobody gave a toss about such information. And also the fact that their commercial value is very, very low means that why should anyone be interested in this? But to me, this is an example of how commercial value has nothing to do with the academic value, because these rings can actually bring the research in this early Christian text greatly forward by combining this group of archaeological objects with literary studies, folklore studies, studies in the history of the early church. Some of these rings were actually published, but without recognizing or seeing the connection to the Testament of Solomon, but they were published by Jeffrey Spear in 2019, and one, namely this one in the middle, was published in 1984, but misread and misunderstood. But that means there are only 2 of these rings which have the much coveted pre-1970 provenance. And that basically means that if I were to follow this rule, then I should either I couldn't do such an investigation at all, or I could only publish this one and the one in Istanbul, which makes no sense at all, because the 10 rings constitute a group. And to imagine that we would publish only these 2 without provenances would lead to the absurd result that we could have a long sustained discussion of whether these rings were actually Christian. Granted that this one was 200 years after it was made, it was put in a Christian grave. That doesn't mean it was in a Christian milieu in the early 3rd century. But we could, in all seriousness, we were supposed to actually have a discussion of whether they came from a Christian environment or Jewish or whatever, even though we know from these rings, which do not have their own pre-1970 provenance, that they were Christian already, because we have the fish and the anchor there. You can see such an academic discussion where we only publish 2 of these rings would be absurd. It would be a travesty, a parody of serious scholarship. So obviously, if you have to do this, you have to publish all 10 of them. And this is essentially then also, you can say, why, so as not to run into trouble here with Anglo-Saxon university publishers. This is then also why, as you can see here, that we opted for a German academic publisher, because the Germans are by and large still a whole lot more sensible than the Anglo-Saxon ones are. I can well imagine that if I'd sent this to Cambridge University Press or such, or God forbid, an American, a US academic publisher, they would have said, we cannot publish this because it publishes archaeological material that was where the provenance before 1970 is unknown. I should also, in conclusion then, add that what we're talking about here are objects where absolutely nothing suggests that there was anything illicit or illegal in their background. They have probably been on the market, old collection histories for generations, but we simply can't know. There's nothing to suggest that their background was in any way illegal, but there's nothing to suggest either that it was legal. But the reverse burden of proof, the demand that you have to prove that an object is innocent, that the objects are presumed guilty, dodgy, stolen, illicitly excavated. They're presumed guilty until proven innocent, is also absurd on the general basic legal principle that there's a good reason why you presume innocence until guilt is proven. And that is for the as any philosopher of logic can tell us, it is damned hard and often impossible to prove a negative. That is basically the reason why guilt has to be proven, not innocence. You can't, in most cases, prove that you're innocent, and the same thing applies to objects. Therefore, I mean, in my view, we have to stick with the principle that objects are okay unless there is something to suggest that they were actually illicit at some point. And that means, of course, but it also entails that it is very, very much incumbent on dealers in antiquities to do everything they possibly can to check up on the provenance of such objects. So those were the words. And you're most welcome to ask me any questions. And Sie können auch Deutsch fragen und ich werde dann auf Deutsch antworten.
Does it work? Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture, and it also opens up another perspective. I didn't really get how you describe the dilemma that when you give the expertise on an object, then its value raises. And this is actually something I find very difficult. And how can we solve this? And you told something about waiting for 20 years, but I didn't get it really. I find your idea very interesting, and we should really think about it, but there is still this dilemma, and maybe you can explain a little bit more, or...
I can try to elucidate a bit. Of course, these problems are incredibly complicated, and that is part of my argument that you cannot simply apply a simple one size fits all rule. That is what the Americans in particular are trying to do, and that can only end in disaster. The thing about academic publication increasing value, and that is the argument behind all these restrictions and the 1970 limit there, is essentially true. You will see that in auction catalogs and such. If an object, if the auction catalog can give the information published by this and that scholar in that journal or whenever, then it will tend to command a higher price. So it is actually true, and it is an ethical dilemma. The problem here is that these American woke archaeologists, in their pursuit of the ultimate highest ethical standards, they end up with getting actually the worst of all worlds. In an ideal world, I will say there would be no trade in antiquities. There would be no private ownership in antiquities, because unavoidably it comes with a whole set of ethical and other problems. But we don't live in an ideal world. That's what the woke archaeologists expect and demand, that the world should be ideal and that they believe it can become ideal. We don't live in an ideal world, and in this real shitty, sorry, real world we unfortunately inhabit, we have to make do actually with finding not the ideal solution, but the lesser evil. What is the least bad solution here? And I gave those two suggestions. The one about a rolling deadline rather than a fixed point, year 1970, that was simply to avoid the ever-increasing accumulation of objects if we stick with 1970, because the longer the time passes, the higher that pile will simply grow.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Ittai. Das war wirklich ein sehr spannender Vortrag, der uns auch mal wieder gezeigt hat, dass es nicht nur Schwarz und Weiß gibt, sondern 50 Shades of Grey. Und ich habe mich erinnert gefühlt an eine Diskussion, die wir vor einigen Jahren geführt haben, als wir uns als dARV einen Verhaltenskodex, einen Code of Conduct gegeben haben. Und wir haben ja heute alles immer bei uns. Ich habe eben mal schnell nachgeguckt, weil auswendig wusste ich das nicht mehr. Da ist eben unter dem Paragraphen 4 Umgang mit Artefakten unklarer Herkunft Folgendes gesagt. Die Mitglieder des dARV sind dazu aufgefordert, Artefakte oder Objekte, deren legale Herkunft mit Stichdatum 14. November 1970 nicht eindeutig nachgewiesen ist, weder zu kaufen noch zu verkaufen oder zu tauschen. Artefakte oder Objekte in Privatbesitz sollen nicht durch prominente Publikation finanziell aufgewertet werden. Soweit solche Artefakte oder Objekte aber einem öffentlichen Museum überlassen werden, wird dies begrüßt, da die Artefakte oder Objekte so dauerhaft der Wissenschaft zugänglich werden. In solchen Fällen ist eine Publikation erwünscht, durch die Artefakte oder Objekte wissenschaftlich bekannt werden und der legale Eigentümer Restitutionsansprüche anmelden kann. Also meine Frage ist, welchem Museum werden Sie die Ringe jetzt übergeben?
Ja, ich habe natürlich darüber gedacht, weil diese Publikation wird wohl die kommerzielle Wert erhöhen. So, früher war es vielleicht, wenn niemand wusste, was diese Ringe bedeutete, dann war es vielleicht 200 € pro Ring. Und jetzt wird es vielleicht, das weiß ich nicht, 600, 800 € pro Ring, aber keine Riesensumme, weil diese sind sehr akademische Objekte. Aber ich habe darüber gedacht und ich glaube tatsächlich Liebighaus Frankfurt, weil die meisten von Kaufmanns Antikensammlungen hat er selbst an Liebighaus Frankfurt überlassen und seine Tochter hat auch weitere von seinen Funden von Abomena, dem Museum in Frankfurt, überlassen. So das ist so das logische Antwort dafür. Darauf habe ich gedacht, wohl Frankfurt. Und zur Erinnerung an Karl Maria Kaufmann auch, der ein hartes Leben gehabt hat und seine Verdienste sind nicht genug geschätzt worden, glaube ich so. Ja. So, ich glaube, das wird der Ende sein. Liebighaus Frankfurt. Ja. Und es freut mich, dass das Museum die Ringe dann nicht ablegen werden. Hoffentlich.
Ich bitte nochmal um einen warmen Applaus für unseren Festredner. Vielen Dank, Ittai, für einen wirklich sehr, sehr schönen Festvortrag, der uns alle nachdenklich gemacht hat. Und ich habe mir natürlich auch Gedanken gemacht, was kann man als Geschenk jemandem machen, der diese kleinen, aber auch hohen Dinge so liebt. Und es trifft sich, dass unser jüngster Katalog ein Band über die Glaspasten im Museum ist. Es ist immerhin die Dactylotheca Universalis von Philipp Daniel Lippert, die sich darin niederschlägt, ein Band relativ jung noch publiziert von Erika Zwierlein-Diel, die leider vor wenigen Wochen verstorben ist. Ja, dieses kleine Präsent möge dich an deinen Aufenthalt hier in Würzburg weiterhin erinnern und nochmal vielen Dank.
Haben Sie vielen Dank dafür, das ist wirklich ein schönes Geschenk. Ich habe tatsächlich das Buch vor 3 Wochen selbst gekauft. Das konnten Sie ja nicht wissen, aber trotzdem, ich habe dann ein Geschenksexemplar oder so.
Ich habe mich schon die ganze Zeit gefragt, wer ist der eine, der das Buch gekauft hat? Okay,
und auch eine schöne Erinnerung von Frau Zwierlein-Diel, die ja vor 2 Wochen, glaube ich, gestorben ist.
Okay, ich habe ja noch ein bisschen Zeit während der Abendveranstaltung, mir Gedanken über ein alternatives Geschenk zu machen. Aber das ist doch eine wunderbare Überleitung zu unserem Abschluss des heutigen Abends. Jetzt geht es in den verdienten Endausklang und dafür müssen wir uns jetzt tatsächlich mal von der schönen Antikensammlung lösen und unten in die Gemäldegalerie gehen. Dort ist ein Buffet aufgebaut, wenn ich richtig unterrichtet bin. Und dort können wir uns weiter unterhalten und werden wir Essen und Trinken genießen. Nochmal der Aufruf, sollten Sie heute Abend schon diese Veranstaltung verlassen, bitte Ihre Namensschilder vorne in der Box hinterlassen, damit wir die wiederverwenden können. Vielen Dank nochmal, Ittai Gradel.
Dankeschön.